Today on the Perception in Action podcast. As a coach, what should you do when your athletes do not seem to be responding to a new practice activity? Are there things you can change? What should you look for? When should you abandon it altogether and move on to something else? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm going to make a mostly futile attempt at answering a very difficult question that I get asked all the time by coaches. What should you do when a new practice activity you've implemented doesn't seem to be working? One of the really great benefits that has come from me doing this podcast is the massive increase in the amount of interaction I have with coaches at all different levels, from youth sports all the way up to professional teams. This has been invaluable for me because the experiential knowledge coaches have really helps guide my research and keep it grounded in real-world application. And hopefully, coaches get some value from me in the form of empirical knowledge I can give based on theory and research. But through this interaction, I've also learned something very quickly. Wow, you all ask difficult questions. Because they work with it every day and are forced to actually get it to work, coaches are very good indeed at finding the holes in our understanding of motor learning and skill acquisition. So, I'm going to start trying to tackle some of these difficult questions in depth on the podcast. The first one I want to look at today is, as I mentioned, the question of what to do when a practice activity doesn't seem to be working. This is a question that I was most recently asked when I was a guest on Stuart Armstrong's excellent Talent Equation podcast. I've included a link in the show notes if you want to listen. I would also recommend you check out his other episodes. I think his podcast is a great complement to mine. Whereas I focus more on the academic research side of things, he emphasizes more the coach-practitioner view. But let's now move on to trying to solve the problem of an ineffective practice activity. Okay, so let's lay out a scenario. Imagine as a coach that you determine that your soccer team needs to improve their passing. Maybe they're too slow to move the ball, miss openings, or just not creating many scoring opportunities. So, you decide to use a constraints manipulation to address this. You create a practice activity with a smaller playing area and add a rule that the team must make at least 5 passes before taking a shot on goal. All sounds good, but after several minutes, you're not seeing any changes in passing behavior. Your activity is clearly not working. What should you do? Well, the first thing I think needs to be done is a careful examination of why you think the activity is not working. What specifically are your athletes doing or not doing that is making you feel this way? For me, this points to the first problem with a lot of practice activities I see. The coach has not clearly defined the goals of the activity, so is not really sure what they're looking for. In my soccer example, what does it mean to improve at passing? What is involved in being a good passer in soccer? Well, here are a few of the things involved if we only consider the passer. The ability to effectively scan the environment while handling the ball and receiving a pass, instead of looking at your feet. Attunement to the action capabilities of your teammates. For example, if I make a quick through ball, will player A be able to get it? Sensitivity to the perceptual information needed to make passing decisions and guide the act of passing. For example, the direction and speed of the pass. Specifically the size of gaps and the rate of change of gap size and interpersonal distance, moving the ball quickly, etc., so on. One of the main ways that I think the problem of ineffective practice activities can be avoided is by going through this kind of thought process before you implement it. The critical questions you want to be asking are, which specific aspects of passing am I trying to improve with this activity, and how exactly is the activity supposed to improve it? I also think it's a good idea to think in terms of a hierarchy of abilities or sub-skills, especially when working with athletes at lower levels. Making good decisions about where to pass the ball first requires being sensitive to the specifying perceptual information. Being sensitive to gap information for passing first requires that the player has his or her head up and is not looking down at the ball, etc. As a coach, it's important to make sure that the skills that are lower down the hierarchy are occurring before you start focusing on the higher ones. This brings me to something I've talked about before on the podcast a few times. As a coach, I think you really need to be tracking your athletes, not just observing them. That is, you need to have a specific, predefined behavior you're looking for and treat pretty much everything else as potentially functional variability. Okay, so as a coach, we've carefully broken down a skill into different components or sub-skills and have designed a practice activity specifically focused on ideally one, but at most a small number of these. So, if players are looking down at the ball, maybe we add an occlusion constraint that blocks the lower part of their visual field. Or if they don't seem to be attuned to gap information, we reduce the size of the field to amplify this. For a practical discussion of how to do this, I would recommend checking out my interview with Damien Farrow back in episode 61, where he talks about the constraints matrix he uses with coaches. Next, we need to address the second problem I see with a lot of practice activities: clearly defining and communicating what it means to be successful in the activity to the athletes involved. When you introduce an activity, it can sometimes be easy to create a conflict with the athlete's natural motivations for playing the game. For example, in soccer, attacking players' motivation is to score. If you introduce a constraint that they have to make at least 5 passes before shooting without clearly explaining why, what is the motivation for doing this? All it is really doing is artificially delaying what they really want to do. This can lead to a very common human behavior that I see all the time in my lab and on the field in practices: satisficing. Satisficing occurs when a performer chooses the first option they find that is just good enough. In other words, is satisfactory, instead of continuing to search for an optimal solution. What this can look like in my soccer example is players moving well away from the defenders, making a few quick short passes with the only goal of satisfying the silly rule the coach has imposed, then moving on to actually playing soccer and trying to score, what they wanted to do in the first place. If there's no real motivation to follow the instructions you give, people are extremely good at finding easy loopholes that will be just good enough. In the lab, I used to see this all the time in my perception experiments. For example, if I'm doing a time to contact experiment and ask a participant which of 2 objects would hit you sooner, what is their motivation? In most cases, it's just to be finished with the study so they can leave and not have to repeat trials. So if I leave them with the option of doing something else that's easier, for example, basing their judgment on distance, they will. Obviously, this type of satisficing behavior can greatly compromise the effectiveness of a practice activity. In my example, the goal of adding the 5-pass constraint is to give players more experience with the perceptual information and task dynamics involved. If they are satisfying this constraint by making a bunch of quick back and forth passes, this obviously will not be achieved. As a coach, there's basically 2 ways you can avoid this type of dysfunctional satisficing behavior. The first is to clearly explain the why of each activity to the players involved. This will hopefully change their motivation and lead them to judge that the simple shortcuts are not satisfactory solutions. An even better way to achieve this is to redesign your practice activity to take away simple satisficing solutions as options. Ideally, you want to do this by somehow manipulating the spatial temporal constraints of the task rather than adding more rules and instructions. For example, to get rid of the passing shortcut, I would try something like drawing 5 zones on the field. In each zone, there's an attacker and a defender, and players must stay in their zones and make 5 passes before shooting. Now you've effectively eliminated the fake pass option as a solution. To me, this is much better than creating a whole rule book for your practice activity. You must make 5 passes, you can't pass to the same person twice in a row, you must be at least 10 feet apart, etc. Too many rules or instructions are likely to overload the athletes with explicit knowledge, and it's not likely to have good transfer to the game. So, as a coach, we've designed what we think is an effective practice activity, both in terms of knowing what we're looking for and getting the players on board. What happens when the players still don't seem to be making any adaptations and coming up with the movement solutions we're looking for? Well, first let's talk about the reasons why this poses a challenge. To start with, we have the infamous performance learning paradox I've talked about many times on the podcast. That is, players looking like they're struggling and not getting it might actually be a better indicator that your activity is leading to improvement than if everything was running smoothly. Learning is messy, remember. Then, of course, we have non-linearities and plateaus in learning, such that it may look like there's no progress at all, then suddenly you see an improvement. This can be driven by a bifurcation in dynamical systems terminology, where a performer becomes attuned to higher-order perceptual information. Finally, there are several types of improvement or learning that can occur without any observable change in performance. A good example of this is the phenomenon of overlearning, where performance hits a plateau, but the efficiency of performance is improving. That is, the performer can produce the same level of outcomes with a reduced amount of effort. For example, even though performance outcomes are staying the same, it's possible that the performer could be developing more efficient attentional control and gaze behavior strategies, such that if you switch to testing them in different conditions, say using a dual task or under high pressure, you will see that they're making gains by being able to handle such conditions. All this is to say that effective motor learning is not as easy to spot as most people think. So how do we get around this? Well, I think there's a few things that can be done. First, as I've already been describing, we should be looking at process as well as performance outcomes, using the well-thought-out hierarchical approach I talked about earlier. While the past may not be going exactly where you want, keeping the head up and scanning the field is evidence of improvement. Second, as a coach, I think you really want to pay attention to the stability of behavior during practice activities. Think of stability as a continuum. At one end, we have completely stable performance, where there's not much variability and athletes are executing the same actions over and over. This situation is often what inspires a coach to come up with a new practice activity in the first place. That is, athletes are stuck in a certain pattern of execution and are not continuing to improve or adapt. This can also happen when a new practice activity provides no impetus for an athlete to change their existing perceptual motor solution. In ecological dynamics terms, there is no attractor to encourage exploration of the affordance landscape. If you imagine the perceptual motor space as a series of peaks and valleys, the players are stuck in one of the valleys and cannot get out. To address this issue, a coach needs to consider two things: feedback and information for learning. As I discussed back in episode 53, when looking at direct learning, in order for movement through perceptual motor space towards a more optimal solution to occur, the performer must first be made aware that their performance is suboptimal and why. In a soccer example, if a player makes a poor passing decision, from the coach's perspective, do they see it as poor too? Do they know why it is not optimal? This is where it's important for a coach to step in with feedback, preferably some using a compare and contrast approach. You did this when there was an opportunity to do that. Once a player is aware their solution is suboptimal, they now need to know how to move in the direction of a better one. This is a common misconception I see a lot of people have about self-organization in practice. It's not just a random flailing away with different options until you find something that works by chance. If the practice environment is designed correctly, this self-organization exploration process is guided by information for learning. That is, there's perceptual information available to the performer which specifies how the non-optimalities in performance can be reduced. Let me try to illustrate this more with a simple example using my soccer passing activity. Imagine that you have a player that is a very poor passer, and that a lot of their passes are getting intercepted. A tempting thing for some coaches to do might be to set up an array of tightly spaced cones and have the player practice passing through them to improve their accuracy. The problem here is that the information for learning that will guide them to a perceptual motor solution that will work in the game is missing. When passing through a bunch of stationary cones, the information that is relevant to guide behavior is the distance between them. While in the game, because players are moving, it is the temporal gap. That is, you need to take into account both distance and speed. In order to ensure that the performer comes up with an effective perceptual motor solution, you need to ensure that this temporal gap information is present, and ideally amplified in some way. The key to ensuring that information for learning is available to a performer is representativeness in your practice design. Too often we artificially restrict conditions and by doing so take this away. Another very different reason why this pattern of overly stable behavior can occur with a new activity is you have not established a culture of psychological safety in your practices. In other words, you've not conveyed to athletes that it's okay to look bad and make mistakes with a new activity. So this needs to be considered as well. At the other end of the stability continuum, we have complete instability, where behavior is highly variable and almost random. This can occur when the demands of the new practice activity are too high for the performer's ability. In other words, you're pushing them too much. The obvious way to address this is to decrease the demands associated with the constraints you've introduced. For example, make the playing area larger, reduce the number of players, etc. What we're looking for is a sweet spot in the middle, comfortable instability, where there's a moderate amount of stability and challenge. The final thing that I think is useful to consider to help determine whether or not a new practice activity is working or not is to introduce perturbations. That is, a new constraint that suddenly and unexpectedly alters the state of the athlete task environment system. For example, for one of the reps, add a time constraint, or add a dual task that requires players to shout something out, or add an extra player to one of the sides. A sudden alteration to the system like this can accomplish two things. First, as I mentioned, perturbations like this can reveal learning that has occurred that was not visible in unperturbed conditions. Second, it can also help to sometimes nudge a performer out of a perceptual motor solution valley. What if we've done all these things, carefully examined the process, looked at stability, and added perturbations, and we still do not see the type of adaptations in behavior the practice activity was designed to produce? Should we stick with the activity and just hope self-organization occurs? For how long? Should we just abandon it and move on to something else? Well, I would make a couple points here. First, we know from motor learning research that if there's sufficient feedback and information for learning available to a performer, there should be some evidence of adaptation, or at least an increase in variability of behavior, fairly quickly. For example, in the experiments I've done where I've asked batters to adjust to a new bat weight, I see changes within a couple swings, as long as there's clear feedback. When I take feedback about the swing away, you either see no adjustments or very high variability, so missing that sweet spot of stability. Another example I will give is from my recent study looking at using a constraints-led approach in baseball batting. Even though I saw no evidence of performance outcome changes, there were significant differences in movement variability by the second block of training. So, I think it's reasonable to expect to see something fairly quickly. But if you are not, I would recommend doing one last thing before you give up. Change the initial conditions of the practice activity. As I discussed back in episode 84, when looking at timescales in motor learning, changing where a performer starts in the perceptual motor landscape can have a large effect on the solution they come up with. So if your activity is not working, try moving it to a different part of the practice session. Try changing up who starts with the ball. Try adjusting the constraints a little bit, like the spacing, the number of players, etc. Put the activity away for now and try it again tomorrow. Doing this changes both the task constraints and most likely the individual constraints of the performers. For example, how fatigued they are, their level of motivation, their focus of attention, etc. The key point is that when we start with a different set of initial conditions, it encourages the performer to take a different route through the perceptual motor space to find the appropriate movement solution. When we keep all the conditions the same, the performer is more likely to settle at a locally optimal solution that it may be difficult to get out of. Finally, if all this doesn't work and you have to completely scrap the activity, don't fret. As Stuart and I talked about in the interview I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, think of coaching as experimentation. Sometimes experiments fail, and figuring out how to not do things and what doesn't work with your athletes can be valuable too. Okay, to sum up, here are the key points I tried to emphasize today. 1. Know which aspect of perceptual motor behavior you're trying to influence with a practice activity, and track that. 2. Where appropriate, look at the activity as a hierarchy of skills. Maybe you're not getting the final behavior you want, but there is an improvement in a sub-skill. 3. Clearly indicate the goals of the activity to players and try to design it such that dysfunctional, satisficing solutions are not available. 4. Remember that many types of learning, for example improvements in efficiency, will not be readily visible to you as a coach. 5. Make sure to evaluate process and stability of the behavior during the activity. 6. Consider using perturbations or surprise constraints to nudge the system a bit and evaluate learning. 7. Make sure there's sufficient feedback and information for learning available to the performer to make them aware their solution is suboptimal and to help them guide self-organization. 8. Try changing initial conditions to start the performer in a new location in the perceptual motor space. And finally, don't be afraid to abandon an activity if it's not working. Even failed experiments can be valuable if you're willing to learn from them. Okay, that's it for today's episode. If you have any more of these types of questions you'd like me to try to tackle, please do contact me. You can email me at robgray@asu.edu or post something on Twitter using my handle ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including an extra monthly episode and transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perception action. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Cut you quick.